There is a coffee shop you pass on your way to work. You stopped in one morning last winter, maybe 2 winters ago now. You ordered. You waited. And at the corner table, there was a couple. 70s, maybe 80s. Hard to tell exactly, the way it gets hard to tell when 2 people have been together a very long time. They looked like the same person in 2 bodies. The way that happens, the woman had a book open in front of her, reading glasses on. The man had his coffee cup down and was watching the street through the window. And then, without looking at her, without her saying anything, he reached across the small table and adjusted her reading glasses. 1 hand, 2 fingers, a slight tilt to the right. She didn't look up from the page. She didn't say thank you. She didn't acknowledge it at all, the way you don't acknowledge something that is just part of the air you breathe. And he picked up his coffee cup again. You watched them for a moment longer than was polite, because you understood, without being able to put it into language, that you had just seen something rare. Not romantic love, exactly. Not devotion in the greeting card sense. Something quieter and more complete. The glasses were slightly crooked. He noticed. He fixed it. That's all. 40 years compressed into a gesture. You didn't know, sitting there, that there was a Greek word for this exact thing. You didn't know that the word appeared in a damaged manuscript discovered in a clay jar in the Egyptian desert in 1945. You didn't know that someone, 1700 years ago, chose that word to describe the relationship between Jesus of Nazareth and Mary Magdalene. And you didn't know that the institution that claims to speak for Jesus decided, in 591 CE, to replace that word with a different one. The word they chose, sinner. The word the manuscript chose, koinonos, companion. My name is Nathan. Some of you know the story. 12 years teaching history at a Catholic school in Evansville, Indiana. Resigned in my early 40s when the questions I was asking made the administration uncomfortable. Now I follow the evidence instead of the institution. I've been working through the Nag Hammadi texts methodically for the better part of 7 years. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary. Most of them have been covered on this channel by now. I've been putting off the Gospel of Philip. I think I knew it was going to be the hardest one. Not because it's the most suppressed, not because the church fought it hardest, because what Philip says is the most human thing in any of these texts, and human things are harder to hold. Let me tell you about the discovery first. December 1945, Upper Egypt, a region called Nag Hammadi. A farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging for sabak. That's nitrogen-rich soil farmers used as fertilizer. He struck something. A large sealed clay jar, about 1 meter tall. He almost didn't open it. He thought there might be a curse inside. Something dangerous. In the end, his curiosity won. The jar contained 13 leather-bound codices, 52 separate texts, written in Coptic, translated from Greek originals that no longer exist. Among them, Codex II, the Gospel of Philip. What happened next is a story of delays, black market sales, and bureaucratic complications that took decades to resolve. It wasn't until 1979 that Elaine Pagels published The Gnostic Gospels, a National Book Award winner, and Philip finally reached the general public. I was in a university library when I first read Philip, late afternoon, the light going flat through the high windows. I had a stack of books and a legal pad covered in notes. I found the passage at line 59. I read it twice. I set my pen down. I read it a 3rd time. And I want to be precise about why I stopped. It wasn't shock. It wasn't indignation. Something else. Recognition, maybe. The way you recognize something you've known a long time but never been able to name. Before I show you what I found, I need to tell you what the Gospel of Philip actually is, because most people imagine a gospel as a narrative, a story. The life of Jesus, miracles, teachings, crucifixion, resurrection. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. That's the template most people carry. Philip is nothing like that. Marvin Meyer at Chapman University produced the standard modern translation, published in Harper One's The Nag Hammadi Scriptures in 2007. His description is precise. He calls Philip not a gospel in the ordinary sense. No birth, no baptism, No Sermon on the Mount, no passion sequence. What Philip is: a collection of theological reflections, sacramental meditations and sayings. Some of them recall Jesus' words, some of them interpret those words, some of them articulate the theology of a specific early Christian community. Scholars place it in the Valentinian Gnostic tradition, probably Syria, probably 3rd century CE. The Greek original is lost. What we have is a Coptic translation. Here's what that means in practical terms. Every word in the Gospel of Philip was chosen deliberately. This text contains no filler, no narrative obligation to include things for story reasons. When Philip uses a specific word, it chooses that word from a range of possibilities. When Philip identifies someone a specific way, that identification is purposeful. Keep that in mind. Because when Philip refers to Mary Magdalene, it doesn't use the word the church would eventually use. It uses the word the couple in the coffee shop had no name for. You have probably used this word, not in a grand speech, not at a wedding. In an ordinary conversation, trying to describe someone, and suddenly, friend wasn't precise enough, and partner felt too formal, and husband or wife described the legal category, but not the actual person. And so you said, companion. You meant the one who stays, who fixes the glasses, who makes the coffee the exact way without asking every single morning, who moves through your life at the same rhythm as your life moves, until the distinction between your life and theirs becomes difficult to locate. That's the word. Not the romantic word, not the institutional word. The word for the person who shares your mission and your interior life. The person you cannot describe any other way. In Greek, the word is koinonos, and 1700 years ago, in a Coptic text translated from a Greek original, in a community that may have known the earliest traditions about Jesus, someone chose that word for Mary Magdalene. The passage is at Philip 59, lines 6 through 11, in Nag Hammadi Codex 2. I'll give you the full translation as published in Marvin Meyer's edition. The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene. The Lord loved Mary more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often. The rest of the disciples said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" The Savior answered and said to them, "Why do I not love you as I love her?" 4 sentences. The most contested 4 sentences in the Nag Hammadi library. Let me start with the word companion. Philip doesn't use mathetes. That's the Greek word for disciple. The word the text uses for Peter, for Thomas, for the others. Philip doesn't use guni. That's wife. Philip doesn't claim a legal marriage. Philip doesn't use phile, female friend, ordinary affection. Philip uses koinonos. Elaine Pagels, in her analysis of the text, explains what koinonos means in the context of ancient Greek usage. The word appears in business and legal contexts to describe partners, people bound together by a shared enterprise, mutual responsibility, a common stake. It appears in Paul's letter to Philemon, verse 17, "If you consider me a koinonos." Paul is asking Philemon to receive the slave Onesimus back, using the language of deep partnership, not sentiment, shared mission. Philip reserves koinonos for Mary alone among Jesus' entire circle, not a disciple, not a wife, the one who shares the mission and interior life. I want to be honest about what I can and cannot claim here. The Gospel of Philip is a 3rd century Gnostic text. Bart Ehrman at UNC Chapel Hill places it firmly in Valentinian Christianity, a sophisticated theological tradition that read the Jesus story allegorically and symbolically. Ehrman is clear on this. Philip is non-historical. It doesn't function as a witness to what Jesus and Mary Magdalene's relationship actually was in life. But here's what Ehrman doesn't dispute, and what nobody disputes. Philip represents a tradition, a community of early Christians who preserved a specific understanding of Mary Magdalene's relationship to Jesus. And their word for that relationship, chosen carefully in a text where every word is chosen carefully, was not sinner. It was companion. Now we need to talk about the damaged manuscript. Same passage, Philip 59, lines 8 and 9. The Lord loved Mary more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her. And there the manuscript breaks. 3 Coptic characters are missing. The parchment is damaged precisely at the word that comes after, on her. Scholars have been arguing about those three characters for decades: the candidates, mouth, cheek, forehead, hand. Some scholars lean toward hand, the culturally normative greeting of that context. Others argue that the disciples' reaction implies something more intimate. A few lean toward forehead, the gesture of blessing, of designation. I'm not going to tell you which interpretation is correct. Nobody can tell you that with certainty. The manuscript is damaged, the three characters are gone. But here's what is not damaged, what comes immediately after. The rest of the disciples were disturbed by this and expressed disapproval. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" Read that carefully. The disciples watched something. They were disturbed by what they watched. Disturbed enough to go to Jesus and complain, to ask directly to his face, "Why do you love her more than us?" The manuscript damage is in exactly the worst possible place. 3 characters missing, surrounded on both sides by the most human scene in the Nag Hammadi library. A group of men who were jealous, who felt overlooked, who had followed Jesus long enough to expect a kind of priority, and who watched a woman receive from him something they didn't have a name for and couldn't stand to see. That jealousy is undamaged. 2,000 years of burial, 1,578 years in a clay jar in the desert, and when the jar was opened, the jealousy was still there, perfectly legible. The empty space in the parchment is the most famous gap in Christian scholarship, but the emotion surrounding it is the most honest thing in the text. I've spent more time with that passage than I expected. Not with the missing word. I've accepted I'll never know the missing word. What I keep coming back to is the disciples' question. Why do you love her more than all of us? They didn't ask it theologically. They didn't ask it doctrinally. They asked it the way someone asks who has been up all night, trying to understand why. That's not a religious question. That's a human question. The oldest human question. And it's sitting there in a manuscript that was buried under Egyptian sand for 1,500 years, waiting for someone to open a clay jar and find it. 7 years ago, before I was doing this full-time, I was still taking on journalism work, a magazine piece, long reads about marriage. I was interviewing people who had been married for decades, trying to understand what sustained commitment looked like from the inside. I interviewed Eleanor in her apartment in Louisville. She was 80 years old. She had been widowed 6 months earlier, after 52 years of marriage. Her husband's name was Gene. I was a third of the way through my prepared questions when I set the list down. Because Eleanor wasn't describing a marriage, she was describing something else. Something for which she kept stopping and reaching for words, and not quite finding them. At one point I asked her directly, "How did you describe Gene to people who'd never met him?" She didn't pause. She said, "He was my companion. Not just my husband, my companion." I wrote it down and moved on. Interviewer's habit. Get the quote, stay in the moment. Next question. Years later, I was in that university library, late afternoon, the light going flat, working through the Nag Hammadi texts. I got to Philip 59, and I looked up the Greek word underneath the Coptic, koinonos. I looked it up, even though I already knew what it would say. Companion. I sat very still for a while. I don't know exactly how long, because Eleanor, in a Louisville apartment in 2019, describing 52 years of living alongside one person, had reached for the same word that someone in the 3rd century reached for when describing Mary Magdalene's relationship to Jesus. Not wife, not follower, not friend, companion. There's something important about what that convergence means, or doesn't mean. It doesn't prove that the Gospel of Philip is historically accurate. It doesn't prove that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had the relationship the text implies. What it shows is that koinonos is the word human beings use when the usual words fail. When what they're describing is too specific and too interior for the available categories. Eleanor used it for Gene because husband wasn't enough. Philip used it for Mary because disciple wasn't enough. And the Church in 591 CE replaced both words with a single one. Sinner. Now we get to the part of Philip that genuinely surprised me. Not because I wasn't expecting it. I'd read the summaries before I went to the library. I knew what was coming. But there's a difference between knowing a fact and sitting with what it means. Philip 67, lines 28 through 30. I'm reading from Marvin Meyer's translation. The Lord did everything in a mystery: a baptism, a chrism, a Eucharist, a redemption, and a bridal chamber. 5 sacraments, listed in ascending order. Baptism, the initiation, the threshold rite. First, chrism, the anointing. Second, Eucharist, communion, the body and blood. Third, redemption. Fourth, and then, last, highest, the supreme sacrament of Valentinian Christianity, the bridal chamber. Not in the romantic sense, not in the institutional sense. In Philip's theology, the bridal chamber is a rite of spiritual union, the deepest form of initiatory participation in divine life. Philip 82, lines 1 through 10. The bridal chamber is not for the animals, nor is it for the slaves, nor for defiled women, but it is for free men and virgins. Philip 86, lines 4 through 10. If anyone becomes a son of the bridal chamber, he will receive the light. The highest Christian sacrament in Philip's community was a form of spiritual partnership, of deep initiated union, above baptism, above the Eucharist. This tradition was not on the fringes of early Christianity. The Valentinian community, where Philip originated, was one of the most intellectually sophisticated and widely distributed Christian movements in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Irenaeus of Lyon, the bishop who attacked them most systematically, did so precisely because they were convincing people. They were drawing followers. Their theology was compelling enough that Irenaeus felt he needed to write an entire treatise against it. Adversus heresies around 180 CE, Irenaeus didn't dismiss Philip's community as a fringe group. He attacked them because they were a serious threat. Here is what I need you to understand about the timeline. Philip's tradition, which places the bridal chamber as the highest sacrament, which places spiritual partnership above all other rites, was circulating in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. The First Lateran Council, which made celibacy mandatory for priests in the Latin Church, was held in 1123 CE, 900 years. For 900 years after Philip was circulating, the Church had no mandatory celibacy for clergy. Priests married, bishops had families, Peter himself had a mother-in-law, which implies a wife. And then, in 1123, the institutional Church decided that the path to spiritual life required the absence of intimate partnership. The earliest Christian communities that Philip represents understood it the other way. The bridal chamber to spiritual partnership was not the obstacle to the sacred life. It was the destination. The Church didn't just reverse Mary Magdalene's identity when they called her a sinner in 591. They reversed the entire theological architecture of the earliest tradition, and they never told you. If you ever felt that the Church's portrait of Mary Magdalene was too small, too reduced, too convenient, too perfectly designed to keep her outside the circle of authority, that feeling had a source. Somewhere in the Egyptian desert, in a sealed clay jar buried for 1578 years, from 367 CE until December 1945, there were texts that agreed with you, communities of early Christians who called her by a different name, who placed her at the center of Jesus's inner circle, not at the margins, who used the word companion. That feeling you carried, that something had been taken, that the version you were given was missing something essential, it wasn't sentiment, it wasn't wishful thinking, it was your instinct reading the reduction and knowing it was a reduction. And someone 17 centuries ago decided you would never read what they preserved. They almost succeeded. Let me show you exactly how it happened. Not as metaphor, as a documented sequence of decisions. 180 CE, Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyon, writes Adversus heresies, against heresies. The primary target is the Valentinian Gnostics, the community that produced the Gospel of Philip. Irenaeus doesn't say their texts are false, he says they're dangerous. That's a specific distinction, and it matters. 312 CE, the Emperor Constantine converts to Christianity. The political landscape begins to shift. Within decades, Christianity moves from persecuted minority to imperial religion. 380 CE, the Theodosian Code. Christianity becomes the official state religion of the Roman Empire. Heresy becomes not a theological problem, but a legal one. 367 CE. This is the critical moment. Patriarch Athanasius of Alexandria issues his 39th festal letter. He lists the books that should be read in Christian communities. He lists the books that should not be read. He specifically orders monks to destroy texts he considers heretical, books bearing the name of the apostles that were leading people astray. The monks at the monastery of St. Pachomius received that order. The monastery was located approximately 4 miles from where Muhammad Ali al-Saman would dig in 1945. Those monks did not destroy the texts. They gathered them, wrapped them in leather, placed them in a large clay jar, sealed the jar, and buried it in the cliffs of the Jabal al-Tarif, the rocky outcroppings at the edge of the Nile Valley. An act of monastic defiance, carried out in silence, at unknown personal risk, by people whose names we will never know. 1578 years later, a farmer looking for fertilizer found what they hid. Without that one act of disobedience, the Gospel of Philip would not exist. Without those unknown monks choosing preservation over compliance, the word koinonos, the word someone chose for Mary Magdalene, would have burned. 367 CE to 1945. That's how long it takes to bury a word. I want to be careful here. This is where channels like this one can go wrong. It's easy to take the Gospel of Philip and build a case on it that the text can't actually support. Bart Ehrman at UNC Chapel Hill is the most important counterweight to understand. He's one of the most prominent New Testament scholars in the English-speaking world, and he is not sympathetic to claims that Philip reveals what Jesus and Mary Magdalene's relationship actually was. His position: Philip is Valentinian Gnostic, 3rd century, Greek original lost, non-historical regarding the life of Jesus. But here is what Ehrman does confirm, and what nobody disputes. The manuscript damage is genuine, the jealousy passage is there. And in his words, the tradition the text represents is ancient. That's the key phrase. The tradition is ancient. Even if Philip was written in the 3rd century, it represents a community that preserved specific traditions about Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Those traditions came from somewhere. They didn't materialize out of nothing in Syria in 250 CE. Marvin Meyer's translation in the Nag Hammadi scriptures, the standard academic edition, is explicit that every word in Philip was deliberately chosen. He spent his career at Chapman University working with these texts. His edition is what scholars cite. Elaine Pagels in the Gnostic Gospels won the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award in 1979. She brought the Nag Hammadi texts to the general public for the first time. On Philip, she's precise. The term koinonos in her analysis implies a companion who shares one's life and work. Same word Paul uses for Philemon. Same word Eleanor used for Jean. What the scholars confirm: the word is real, the tradition is ancient, the jealousy passage is undamaged, and the manuscript damage is exactly where it is. What no scholar can tell you, what the 3 missing characters were, and what no scholarship can measure, what it cost to bury this text for 1578 years. J.J. Benítez has been investigating the historical Jesus for over 40 years. More than 15 trips to Israel, decades cross-referencing the Gospels with archaeological evidence, with the topography of 1st century Galilee, with Josephus, with the Dead Sea Scrolls, with the apocryphal texts. The result is the Caballo de Troya series, Trojan Horse, 17 novels presented as investigative fiction, but sourced from primary historical material. Throughout the series, Mary Magdalene appears not as a disciple and not as a wife, but as something that Benítez never names directly. Probably because he can't find the right word in Spanish, or in any language. She funds part of the mission. Luke 8, verses 2 and 3 confirms this historically. Mary Magdalene is listed among the women who traveled with Jesus and provided for them out of their own means. A detail so ordinary, it's easy to miss. She wasn't a follower in the abstract. She was a partner in the practical. She's present at the crucifixion, while the male disciples have fled. She's first to the empty tomb. Not disciple, not wife. The one who stayed. Benítez arrived at this portrait through 40 years of investigation, 15 trips to Israel, and 17 books. He arrived at it without the Gospel of Philip. He arrived at it through the canonical Gospels, read with historical precision, cross-referenced with geography and archaeology. And Philip arrived at the same portrait in the 3rd century, in Coptic in Syria, through a tradition that may reach to the earliest communities of Jesus' followers. 2 entirely different paths, 2 entirely different centuries, 2 entirely different sources. The same word waiting at the end of both, koinonos, companion. I find that convergence harder to dismiss than almost anything else I've encountered in 7 years of this research. Not because it proves Philip is historically accurate, but because it suggests that something real is underneath both accounts. That the people who knew Mary Magdalene, or who preserved the earliest traditions about her, saw something in her relationship with Jesus that the canonical Gospels, shaped for other purposes, were not designed to name. And when people who had no agenda, no institutional pressure, no reason to invent, tried to name it, they kept arriving at the same word. You're back in the coffee shop. The coffee you ordered is cold. At some point you stop drinking it because you've been somewhere else entirely. The older couple is still at the corner table. The woman has closed her book. They're talking now, quietly, about something ordinary. You can't hear the words, but you can see the quality of their attention to each other, the specific gravity of 2 people who have built something together over a very long time. He adjusted her glasses an hour ago. Or maybe it was 40 years ago. In their time, it's the same moment. Somewhere in the space between what Philip wrote and what the church decided you needed to know, there is a question that has been waiting 1700 years. Not the question about the 3 missing characters. That question will probably never be answered. The manuscript is what it is. The question underneath that one. What did it cost to bury the word companion? Not in theological terms, not in institutional terms, in human terms. Someone in the 3rd century, writing carefully in a community that preserved what they had received, chose koinonos for Mary Magdalene. They chose it because methetes wasn't enough, because gune wasn't enough, because phili wasn't enough. They needed the word that described the person who shares your mission and your interior life, the person you cannot describe any other way. And 4 miles from where they buried that word, for 15 centuries and more, people went about their lives. Seasons, floods from the Nile, empires rising and falling, the rise and fall of everything the world considers permanent. And under the sand, in a sealed clay jar, the word was still there. Waiting for a farmer looking for fertilizer, waiting for an afternoon in a university library, the light going flat through high windows. Waiting for a woman named Eleanor to describe 52 years of living alongside someone and reach for the only word that fit. Waiting for you to sit in a coffee shop and watch an old man adjust his wife's reading glasses and understand, without being able to say why, that you had just seen something rare. You now know the word for what you saw. You now know it appeared in a manuscript that was buried to prevent you from reading it. And you now know that the institution that replaced that word with sinner had a reason. Not a theological reason, a practical one. Because the word companion, in the mouth of Jesus, addressing Mary Magdalene, is a problem the church has never found a clean answer to. The disciples who watched it happen asked the question 2,000 years ago. They never got an answer either. You decide what to do with that.